Hi everybody, today I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change and the effect it has on Indigenous people. So what I would like you to do, I want you to listen to the lecture and I want you to listen to some sites that I'm going to refer you to. Then I want you to do the readings for this topic and I want you to do the weekly activities for this topic. Okay, so to begin, the Indigenous people of the Arctic have experienced the most impacts of the early stages of climate change. And this is mainly due to the reductions in sea ice that has been occurring in recent decades. The climate change that is occurring in the Arctic is affecting Indigenous people in 4 ways: through mitigation of carbon emissions, through local adaptation to climate change, through research and monitoring of climate change impacts, and through national and international political advocacy. Now, 2 terms that you will hear mentioned when it comes to climate change is mitigation and adaptation. Now, mitigation is about the efforts to reduce or stabilize greenhouse gases, and adaptation is planned adjustments in a system to reduce the negative impacts of climate change. Now, the government's plan is for adaptation rather than mitigation. Although Indigenous people around the world produce the least greenhouse emissions, climate change poses serious threats to them. When it comes to environmental policy, Indigenous people are not really afforded much attention as the rights of governments and nation states take precedence. Although governments are committed to adaptation, there has been no real interest in how these adaptation policies will impact on Indigenous people. A recent report by the Arctic Council and the International Arctic Science Committee made the following points. So I urge you to have a look at that on the internet, the Arctic Council and the International Science Committee. Again, they made the following points: that Arctic is warming rapidly and major changes are expected, that the consequences of warming of the Arctic will be felt all over the world, that there will be major changes on the Arctic vegetation system, and that there will be increased storm activity in coastal areas. There will be reductions in sea ice that will cause problems when it comes to accessing natural resources, and there will be severe impacts on the economies and cultures of Indigenous people. And also, ultraviolet radiation levels will rise and will affect the health of people, plants and animals. Now, some of the adaptation policies that governments are thinking about include shoreline reinforcement, relocation of buildings and infrastructure, changing building materials, increasing supplies of bottled water to counter the damage of natural water supplies, amending fishing and hunting styles and quotas, changing consumer and producer food habits, identifying dangerous areas, expanding search and rescue resources for increases in things such as snow avalanches and flooding, and developing emergency plans. Now, the ICC have a goal. These goals include that the climate change in the Arctic are closely monitored, and that responses to climate change involve their autonomy, the Indigenous people's autonomy. Now, they also released the Inuit Declaration on Arctic Sovereignty, which asks that governments try to balance economic development activity with sustainability to avoid the overuse of natural resources. Also, to respond to climate change in a way that does not lower the living standards of Indigenous people, and to avoid doing things such as relocating Indigenous people from their traditional homelands. So one of the points the Indigenous people are making through that declaration is that Western countries have had their industrial revolutions, and as a result they have lots of wealth, lots of employment, etc. And it's been their industrial revolutions that have impacted on climate change. So this declaration is saying that Indigenous people don't want to have their access to industrial development hampered because Western countries have already used their opportunity and now Indigenous people can't because of climate change. So that's what they're saying. You Western countries have had your opportunity. We don't want you to tell us now that we cannot have ours. Okay? So the Arctic Council, well, the ICC is a member of the Arctic Council. So have a look at this, the Arctic Council on the internet. Now, the Arctic Council was established in 1996. The members of this council are Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, the Russian Federation, Sweden, and the United States of America. Now, the Council oversees the implementation of the Arctic Environment Protection Strategy, which sets out the role of all member countries and Indigenous people play in responding to climate change. Now, each year, the Council releases an update on its priorities and its achievements. The Inuit people, as I said, released their own climate change strategy in 2003. However, no government funding has been allocated to it. And this is one of the big issues that you will not hear about when it comes to climate change, is how much money it is going to cost. So, for example, are we all going to turn off our air conditioners for 6 months to save a yellow tree frog in the Amazon? It's something that governments would not want to do, to take money away from things such as employment, education, health and the economy. So one of the things you will not hear mentioned when it comes to climate change is the amount of money involved, which is going to be significant. So the Inuit people are wanting something done, however they do not have the power to actually allocate resources and get things happening. So they are trying to get governments to see that climate change is already occurring. Now, although governments want to go the adaptation way, there had not really been any further planning around this. So if this is going to be a serious consideration, Indigenous people should be involved in discussions and planning. Climate change becomes entangled with human rights and social justice when Indigenous people are not involved in discussions about things that affect their food and water supplies, their knowledge systems, their culture, traditions and homelands. So Inuit people have called on governments to respond to climate change quickly. And governments around the world, as I said, seem to be committed to mitigation. Reports such as the Arctic Climate Change Impact Assessment show that we really do not know what the impacts of climate change in the Arctic will be. This, of course, means that there has been no policy development, as we need to know what the problems are before we develop policy responses to them and before we start allocating funding and resources to them. Now, although there has been much international talk about climate change, there has been little government action. The United Nations and its member governments have been active in their pursuit of adaptation policies, and the United Nations has established programs to support countries with adaptation. The Canadian government supports research on adaptation and has also established agencies that are focused on adaptation. Adaptation responses can mean that governments can respond to climate change now. Policymakers do not want to allocate funds, especially long-term funds, to things they do not really know much about. So governments need to work with Indigenous communities now to develop practical responses to climate change. If not, Indigenous people may be forced to change their hunting and gathering techniques, which will impact on animal populations that may already be at risk. There is no doubt that temperatures are rising around the world, mainly because of increased carbon dioxide emissions and other greenhouse gases. The place that is experiencing the most at the moment is the Arctic. Over the past few decades, the temperature of the Arctic has risen twice as much as anywhere in the world. This is staggering when you consider that it is all snow and ice. Now, it is expected that this global warming will accelerate this century. The Arctic provides the world with supplies of natural resources such as oil, gas and fish. And all of this is expected to be affected by climate change. So if you think of an area of land the size of Texas and Arizona together, that's how much sea ice has melted in recent decades. The damage that global warming will do to natural ecosystems is expected to be severe. For example, polar bears are not expected to survive in the wild, and this itself will damage the ecosystem. Certain species of seal are also not expected to survive, as they rely on the ice to give birth, to raise their young, and to forage for food under the ice. Similarly, reindeer populations will also be affected, as there will be changes in vegetation and to food supplies that they have always relied on, and these food supplies will probably decline. This will affect how these animals raise their young and give birth, and also affects food supplies and cultures and traditions of Indigenous people. Now, these changes will have a drastic and direct impact on Indigenous people who rely on these animals, plants, for food, for cultural identity, to continue culture, and for social and economic purposes. Also because Indigenous people in the area are typically on low incomes, it will have a direct impact on their diet, health and well-being. And of course, where we have low incomes, people are susceptible to use the environment to make a quick buck. So we can go and catch all these turtles and sell them to other people, and that's not good if turtles are already in jeopardy of declining. So rising sea levels and sea ice means that there will be increased wave activity and storm surges. Already there are coastal communities that are being forced to relocate and others that are seriously considering relocating. Either way, being counterproductive against climate change will cost lots of money. In the Torres Strait, for example, salt water is already washing up into cemeteries, into buildings and onto people's doorways of their houses. And of course this is salt water, so it causes damage. Now, as the vegetation changes, many animal species will struggle, numbers will decline, and some will become extinct as they rely on the current vegetation for survival. Now, as the sea ice melts, there will be need for international strategies and policies to be put in place that relate to things such as shipping and conservation, as more people are going to be coming into these waters because they are more accessible because of a lack of ice. Now, Indigenous people are severely affected in every aspect of their lives when it comes to climate change. Culture and traditions, health and well-being, human rights, sovereignty, local infrastructure and economies. The Anchorage Declaration, and I'll get you to have a look at this, the ANCHORAGE Declaration, which is a document released by representatives from the Arctic, North America, Asia, the Pacific, Latin America, Africa, the Caribbean and Russia, states that we are no longer in a stage of climate change, that we are in a climate crisis. So terms such as climate change can make us think that it hasn't actually happened yet. Now in this declaration they call for two courses of action. One, the phasing out of fossil fuel development on or near their lands. And two, the phasing out of fossil fuel that is done in a way that does not infringe on Indigenous people's rights to development, as I said earlier. The declaration also calls on the United Nations to acknowledge Indigenous people's traditional knowledge and to use this knowledge to develop responses to climate change. In addition, the declaration also calls for the United Nations to recognise the historical damage done to Indigenous people and their lands as a result of greenhouse emissions, and they call on the countries responsible to pay this debt. The declaration also calls for more Indigenous power over regional natural resources. So Indigenous people who are already living in isolated areas will experience new diseases as the climate warms, and many will have the sources of their traditional medicines damaged. Another problem is their lack of finances and power to respond to climate change. Climate change in the Arctic extends to Indigenous people living in coastal communities around the world. In Africa, more than 1/4 of the population live close to the coast. It is estimated that flooding as a result of rises in sea levels will affect more than 70 million people, and entire cities could disappear over the next century. Asia as well, about 1.7 billion people live in coastal areas throughout Asia. Rising sea levels will have a devastating effect on these people. Latin America as well, the coral reefs around the Central American region is home to some of the most fragile ecosystems in the world. Climate change could severely damage these ecosystems and could also jeopardize many of the natural resources that coastal communities rely on. It has taken some time, but Indigenous knowledge is now being used to counter the effects of climate change. In Honduras, one village used traditional knowledge for farming, and this village was the least affected by Hurricane Mitch in 1998, and this village only lost 10% of its crops. Now this is because they used their Indigenous knowledge to plant under certain trees that have roots that reduce soil erosion. Now, the Honduras government, together with the United Nations, are promoting the use of traditional practices. However, the onset of climate change will also require much intervention from Western knowledge. For example, organisations such as Oxfam are providing Indigenous communities with weather monitoring stations so they can deal with unpredictable weather patterns that are a result of climate change. So some of the practical responses for Indigenous coastal communities to climate change include crop diversification to counter increased and new diseases to plants, changing hunting and gathering styles, changes in the way people interact with plants and animals, using assistance from international foreign aid agencies. Now, some of the research that could be taking place includes identifying which Indigenous communities are vulnerable and why, creating awareness of climate change among remote and isolated people, determining how and if past Indigenous adaptation strategies can work together with Western knowledge for regional outcomes, monitoring the stress caused by climate change and identifying ways to alleviate it, are some of the things that could be happening now. Okay? So what I want you to do now that you've listened to this lecture is do an internet search for Carbon Cowboy 60 Minutes. And I want you to have a look at that video, and it shows you another way that Indigenous people could be taken advantage of through climate change. So how this carbon tax works is one company will pay another landowner not to burn so they can burn. So watch this video and you will see what I mean. Thank you once again for your time.